When Jake inherited his grandfather's farm in rural Iowa, he saw it as a fresh start. He'd been laid off from his tech job in Chicago, his apartment lease was up, and the idea of leaving the city behind felt like freedom. The farmhouse was old but solid, built in the 1890s, sitting on 40 acres of overgrown fields. His grandfather had been the last one to work the land, and that was over a decade ago. Jake moved in during late September. The house needed work, but it was livable. What concerned him more was the barn. It was a massive structure about 100 yards from the house, red paint peeling, roof sagging in places. His plan was to eventually tear it down, but that would have to wait until spring. The first night, Jake heard something from the barn. It was past midnight, and he was almost asleep when a loud bang echoed across the property, like something heavy falling. He sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the bedroom window. The barn door was swinging open, creaking on rusty hinges. Jake told himself it was just the wind. Old barns made noise. But the next morning, when he went to close the door, he noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the dust inside the barn. Boot prints, adult-sized, leading from the door to the back of the barn, where old farming equipment sat covered in tarps. He followed the prints. They stopped at a wooden ladder leading up to the hayloft. Jake's hands were shaking as he climbed. The loft was dark, lit only by thin beams of sunlight pushing through gaps in the walls. And there, in the corner, he found evidence that someone had been living there. A sleeping bag, relatively new. Canned food, empty and stacked neatly. A camping lantern. Cigarette butts. Someone had been staying in his barn. And recently. Jake called the sheriff. Deputy Morrison came out that afternoon, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd known Jake's grandfather well. "You're not the first person to report this kind of thing," Morrison said, examining the makeshift camp. "We've had issues with drifters using abandoned properties. They usually move on once they know someone's living here. But you should keep your doors locked, and maybe get yourself a firearm, just in case." That night, Jake made sure every door and window in the farmhouse was locked. He'd bought a baseball bat from town and kept it next to his bed. Around 2 a.m., he woke to the sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway outside. He crept to the window and looked out. A figure stood in the driveway, barely visible in the moonlight. A man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap. The man was staring directly at Jake's bedroom window, completely motionless. Jake's blood ran cold. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was outside his house. The dispatcher told him to stay inside, that a deputy was on the way. But Jake couldn't look away from the window. The man hadn't moved. Hadn't even shifted his weight. He just stood there in the driveway, staring up at the house. After what felt like an eternity, the man turned and walked toward the barn. He moved with an odd, limping gait, dragging his right leg slightly. When Deputy Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, the man was gone. They searched the barn with flashlights, but found nothing. The sleeping bag and supplies Jake had seen that morning had vanished. "Look," Morrison said, "I'm going to be straight with you. About 15 years ago, there was a guy who worked for your grandfather, helped with the harvest, did odd jobs. Name was Vernon Cross. One day, Vernon had some kind of mental breakdown, attacked your grandfather with a pitchfork. Your grandfather fought him off, and Vernon ran into the woods. They found him 3 days later, dead. He'd hanged himself from a tree at the edge of your property." Jake felt sick. "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" "Because it was a long time ago, and we didn't want to spook you. But Vernon lived in that barn. Your grandfather let him stay there between jobs. And people around here, some of them claim they've seen Vernon walking the property at night. I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm telling you what I've heard." Jake wanted to leave right then, pack his stuff and drive back to Chicago. But he had nowhere else to go, and he refused to be driven out by local ghost stories or some homeless guy playing games. He installed motion sensor lights around the property, got a shotgun, and learned how to use it. For a few weeks, nothing happened. Jake almost convinced himself it was over. Then, one night in late October, he woke to the sound of scratching. Not outside, but inside the house. Something was scratching at his bedroom door from the hallway, slow and deliberate. Jake grabbed the shotgun and aimed it at the door, his hands slick with sweat. "I'm armed," he shouted. "I will shoot you." The scratching stopped. Jake heard footsteps retreating down the hallway, that same dragging limp he'd noticed before. He heard the back door open and close. When he finally worked up the courage to check, the back door was still locked from the inside, locked with the deadbolt that could only be turned from inside the house. Jake left the next morning and never went back. He sold the property at a massive loss to a developer who planned to tear everything down and build subdivisions. But Jake heard later that construction workers refused to stay on site after dark. They reported seeing a tall, thin man watching them from the tree line, limping back and forth, never getting any closer, but never leaving. The farmhouse still stands empty. No one will buy it now. My name is Ashley, and this happened to me and my husband 2 years ago. We'd bought a foreclosed farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, a fixer-upper we got for almost nothing at auction. The previous owners had abandoned it after the bank started foreclosure proceedings. They'd left in a hurry, from what we could tell. Personal items still in drawers, food still in the pantry. The house was built in the 1920s, a 2-story colonial with good bones but terrible cosmetic condition. Our plan was to renovate it ourselves and flip it for profit. We'd done this twice before with houses in the suburbs. We thought we knew what we were getting into. The problem started when we began tearing down walls. The house had been remodeled badly over the years, with additions that made no sense, and rooms that seemed oddly proportioned. We decided to take it down to the studs and start fresh. We were working on the first floor parlor when my husband, Derek, stopped suddenly. "Ash, come look at this." He'd pulled away a section of plaster to reveal the wall cavity. Inside, tucked between the studs, were dozens of bundles wrapped in old cloth. Derek pulled one out and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a dead bird, a crow, desiccated and ancient, its wings spread and pinned in place with small nails. We found 13 more in that wall alone, all crows, all positioned the same way, wings spread like they were trying to fly. Each one was wrapped in cloth that had rotted with age. "What the hell is this?" Derek said, staring at the pile of bird corpses we'd laid out on the floor. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. We threw them all away and kept working, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we'd found something we weren't supposed to. 2 days later, we started on the upstairs bathroom. Behind the tile, we found more bundles. But these weren't birds. They were dolls. Small, handmade cloth dolls, crudely stitched with button eyes and yarn hair. There were 9 of them, each one stained with something dark that might have been blood. That night, Derek wanted to leave. "This is too weird," he said. "People don't hide dead birds and creepy dolls in their walls unless something seriously wrong was going on here." But we'd already sunk our savings into this place. We couldn't just abandon it. So we kept working, kept tearing down walls, and kept finding things. Bundles of hair tied with string. Teeth, both human and animal, wrapped in paper. Photographs of people we didn't recognize, their faces scratched out. And symbols carved into the wood of the studs themselves. Circles and stars and shapes that looked almost like letters but weren't any alphabet I recognized. The worst find was in the master bedroom. We'd torn out the old closet and found a small door hidden behind it, maybe 3 feet tall. It opened into a crawl space that extended under the eaves of the roof. Derek shined his flashlight inside. "Oh my God," he whispered. The entire crawl space was covered in writing. Every surface, floor, walls, ceiling, covered in words written in black marker. The same phrases over and over. "Keep them in, don't let them out, sealed, sealed, sealed. The walls must hold." And in the center of the space, a large circle drawn in what looked like dried blood. Inside the circle were more of those cloth dolls, dozens of them arranged in a spiral pattern. We called the police. We didn't know what else to do. Maybe it was evidence of a crime. Maybe it was just the work of someone mentally ill, but we needed someone official to document this. The officer who came out looked disturbed, but not surprised. "You folks ever hear about the Ashford family?" he asked. We hadn't. He told us that the family who'd lived here before the foreclosure, the Ashfords, had a daughter who disappeared. She was 16 years old, vanished one night 6 years ago. Just gone, no trace, no evidence of foul play. The parents claimed she'd run away, but people had suspicions. The police investigated but never found anything. After the daughter disappeared, the mother had some kind of breakdown, the officer continued. Neighbors reported hearing her at night, doing something in the house, hammering, moving furniture. She stopped leaving the property. The father worked night shifts, wasn't home much. By the time the bank foreclosed, the mother had been institutionalized. We asked where the mother was now. The officer said she'd died in the psychiatric facility 6 months ago, refused to eat, just wasted away. The only thing she'd say, over and over, was, "The walls must hold." Derek and I didn't sleep in that house again. We hired a crew to finish the demolition and were there during the day to supervise. When they tore into the walls of the basement, they found the final horror. Behind a false wall in the basement, there was a small room, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet. The door had been nailed shut from the outside and then drywalled over. When they broke through, the smell that came out made everyone sick. Inside was a mattress, a bucket, and chains bolted to the wall. The chains were empty, but forensics found DNA, the missing daughter's DNA. She'd been kept in that room, chained up, for months before she died. The coroner estimated she'd been dead for about 5 years, sealed up in that wall the entire time. The mother hadn't been trying to keep something supernatural in. She'd been trying to keep her daughter's body hidden. All those occult symbols, all those rituals, they'd been her fractured mind's attempt to somehow seal away what she'd done. Or maybe to keep her daughter's spirit from escaping. We sold the property to a demolition company. They tore everything down, hauled it all away. I heard they built a Dollar General on the lot. Sometimes I drive by and look at it, and I think about that little room in the basement and those words scrawled in the darkness. The walls must hold. This story was told to me by my uncle, and I believe every word because I've known him my whole life, and he's the most straightforward, honest person I've ever met. He's not the type to make things up or exaggerate. This happened to him in the fall of 2009. My uncle Robert bought a small farm in upstate New York, 20 acres, mostly wooded, with a rundown farmhouse he planned to fix up for retirement. The property bordered state forest land on 2 sides, which Robert loved. Privacy, nature, perfect for a quiet retirement. The previous owner was an elderly woman named Mrs. Halloway who had lived alone there for over 30 years. She was moving to a nursing home and seemed desperate to sell quickly. Robert got the property for well below market value. He should have asked more questions about why. When Robert moved in, his nearest neighbor, a man named Carl, who lived about half a mile down the road, came by to introduce himself. Carl seemed nervous, kept glancing at the tree line where Robert's property met the forest. "Listen," Carl said, "I don't want to freak you out, but there's something you should know. Don't go into the woods after dark. And if you hear anything coming from the forest at night, ignore it. Don't go looking for it." Robert laughed. "What? You got bears? Coyotes?" Carl didn't laugh back. "Just trust me on this. Stay out of the woods at night, and don't cross the property line after sunset." Robert thought Carl was being weird, maybe trying to haze the new guy with local superstitions. But that first night, he understood. Around midnight, Robert heard singing. It was coming from the forest, a woman's voice, singing something that sounded like a lullaby. The voice was clear and close, like someone was just inside the tree line. Robert went to the window and looked out at the dark wall of trees behind his house. He could see a figure, pale and white, moving between the trees. It looked like a woman in a long dress, walking slowly parallel to the property line, singing that haunting lullaby. Robert grabbed a flashlight and went outside. He told himself it was probably just a confused hiker, maybe someone who was lost. But as he approached the tree line, the singing stopped. The figure stopped moving. And then it turned to face him. Robert couldn't make out features in the darkness, but he could see it was tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, and it was completely still, standing just inside the tree line, right at what Robert assumed was the property boundary. "Are you okay?" Robert called out. "Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, and Robert felt every instinct in his body screaming at him to go back inside. He backed away slowly, and the figure didn't follow. It just watched him until he reached his house. The next morning, Robert walked to the property line where he had seen the figure. He found a series of old stones, half buried in the ground, marking the boundary. And carved into each stone was the same symbol, a circle with a cross through it. He asked Carl about it later that day. Carl sighed. "Those are boundary stones. They've been there for over 100 years. My grandfather told me about them. The story goes that something lives in those woods, has lived there longer than anyone can remember. The early settlers made a deal with it. It stays in the forest, we stay on our land. The stones mark the agreement. That's ridiculous, Robert said. Maybe, Carl agreed, but people who've crossed that line at night don't come back the same. Miss Halloway's husband went into those woods 20 years ago, tracking a deer he had shot. He was only gone for an hour, but when he came out, he couldn't speak, couldn't function. They put him in a facility, and he died there 6 months later without ever saying a word about what he saw. Robert wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but he couldn't forget that impossibly tall figure, or the way it had stood so perfectly still, waiting at the boundary. For weeks, the pattern continued. Every night around midnight, the singing would start. The figure would appear, walking the property line, staying just inside the forest. Always the same lullaby, always the same height, always stopping to watch if Robert looked outside. Then, one night in November, Robert's dog got loose. Max was a golden retriever, friendly and curious. Robert heard him barking near the tree line around 11 p.m. He ran outside and saw Max at the edge of the property, barking at the woods. And the figure was there, closer than Robert had ever seen it. It was standing right at the property line, bent down slightly, like it was looking at the dog. In the moonlight, Robert could finally see it clearly. It wasn't human. The proportions were wrong, the arms too long, the fingers extending down past where knees should be. The face was pale and smooth with dark holes where eyes should be and a mouth that stretched too wide. "Max!" Robert screamed. "Come here!" The dog turned and ran back to Robert, and as it did, the thing straightened up to its full height and smiled. The mouth opened impossibly wide, showing row after row of teeth, and it took one step forward. Its foot crossed the property line, onto Robert's land. Carl had been wrong. The boundary wasn't absolute. It could cross if it wanted to. Robert grabbed Max and ran inside, locking every door and window. The singing started then, but it was different. Louder, closer, coming from right outside the house. And then came the scratching. Long, dragging sounds against the siding, like those two long fingers scraping against the house. It lasted until dawn. When the sun came up, everything stopped. The thing was gone. Robert sold the property within a month. He told the buyers nothing, just like Mrs. Halloway had told him nothing. He moved to Florida, as far from those woods as he could get. But sometimes, he still hears that lullaby in his dreams. And he wonders how long the next owners will last before they realize that some property lines exist for a reason, some boundaries should never be crossed, and some neighbors are better left undisturbed in the darkness where they belong.